There is a growing belief in the modern world that science explains everything. We hear it in classrooms, on podcasts, in debates, and in every corner of the internet. If we understand the laws of physics, why do we need God? If evolution explains life, why look beyond nature? If the brain creates thoughts, why talk about a soul? It sounds confident. It sounds modern. It even sounds liberating. But beneath that confidence hides a deeper question, a question that refuses to disappear. If science explains the universe, who explains why the universe is there to be explained? This video begins here, at the philosophical fault line between description and origin, between mechanism and meaning. Science can describe gravity, but it cannot tell you why gravity exists. Science can map out your neurons, but it cannot tell you why those neurons produce a conscious self. Science can measure the age of the cosmos, but it cannot explain why there is a cosmos instead of nothing. So today, we step into one of the most important intellectual conversations of the 21st century, a conversation that touches physics, philosophy, theology, psychology, and the very heart of human meaning. If science can explain so much, why do we still need God? This is not a defensive question. It is not an emotional question. It is not even a religious question. It is a rational question. Because the moment someone says, science explains everything, they have already left science and stepped into philosophy, the very territory they believe they have outgrown. So let the journey begin with two simple but devastating questions. Questions that philosophers have wrestled with for centuries. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why does the universe follow mathematical laws so precise that human beings can discover and describe them? If science explains everything, these should be the easiest questions in the world. But they are, in fact, the hardest. Because science deals with what happens inside the universe. God deals with why the universe exists at all. And those are not the same type of explanation, not even close. This video will not argue that God replaces science. It will argue something far more profound. God is the reason science makes sense in the first place. What science actually explains. When people say, science explains everything, they rarely notice that they are redefining what explanation actually means. Science does explain, brilliantly, powerfully, beautifully. But it explains in a very specific way. Science describes the mechanisms inside the universe. It does not explain the existence of the universe itself. This distinction is not small. It is everything. Let's slow down and look at what science actually does. Science measures. Science predicts. Science observes patterns and formulates laws. Science tells us how things interact, how particles behave, how stars form, how biology adapts, how chemicals combine. In other words, science explains processes, not origins. Mechanisms, not meaning. Interactions, not ultimate causes. Think of gravity. Physics can describe how masses attract each other. It can give formulas, make predictions, and show how gravity shapes galaxies. But physics does not, and cannot, tell you why gravity exists in the first place. It simply starts with gravity as a given. Or take consciousness. Neuroscience can map the brain. It can identify neural pathways and measure electrical activity. But neuroscience cannot answer the most fundamental question of human experience. Why is there a conscious self experiencing anything at all? Why is there something like subjective awareness, instead of nothing but biological machinery? Science tells you. Here is how neurons fire. It cannot tell you. Here is why those neurons give rise to a first-person experience of life. Even in biology, often presented as the ultimate reductionist field, science explains adaptation, mutation, natural selection. But it does not explain why life exists instead of a sterile universe full of lifeless particles. It can tell you how living things change over time, but not why nature is structured in a way that makes life possible. This is why Nobel Prize-winning physicist Steven Weinberg once said, "The more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless." Because science can map the story, but it cannot explain the storyteller. It can uncover the chapters, but not the author. It can show the ink on the page, but not why the book exists. And here is the subtle irony. The moment someone claims, "Science explains everything," they have quietly stepped beyond the boundaries of science. Because science, by definition, operates within a universe that already exists. It assumes laws that are already in place. It uses logic and mathematics that it cannot justify on its own. Science is powerful, but its power comes from its limitations, not its boundlessness. And so, the real question becomes, if science describes the structure of reality, who explains why reality has structure at all? The limits of scientific explanation. If science is one of humanity's greatest achievements, and it is, then we honor it best by understanding what it can do. And what it cannot do. Not by shrinking its power, but by refusing to turn it into something it was never designed to be. Because for all its brilliance, science has three unavoidable limits. Not temporary limits. Not gaps of ignorance. But structural limits, hard boundaries built into the very nature of scientific inquiry. Let's walk through them one by one. 1. Logical and philosophical limits. Science rests on foundations it cannot prove. It assumes the validity of logic. It assumes that mathematics corresponds to the real world. It assumes that human reason is trustworthy enough to interpret data. But science cannot scientifically prove any of these assumptions. Try this experiment. Can you design a laboratory test to prove that logic is valid? Or that the laws of mathematics are necessarily true? Or that your reasoning faculties are reliable? You can't. Because these questions belong to the realm of philosophy, not physics. And here is the irony. Science cannot justify the very tools science uses. It must borrow them from somewhere deeper, from the underlying structure of reality. 2. Metaphysical limits. Science studies the universe. But it cannot explain the universe's existence. It cannot explain why the universe exists at all. Why its laws are stable. Why its laws are intelligible. Why those laws can be written in elegant mathematics. Why anything follows a law rather than chaos. Science takes all of this as a given, a starting point. But, given, by what? Given, by whom? You cannot use the universe to explain the universe. You cannot use natural laws to explain why natural laws exist. This is why the question, why is there something rather than nothing, will never be answered with a microscope. Because it is not a scientific question. It is a metaphysical one, a question about being itself. 3. Existential limits. Science can tell you the chemical structure of a tear, but not the meaning of sorrow. It can analyze the neurons involved in falling in love, but not the meaning of love. It can describe what humans do, but not what humans ought to do. Science gives us power. Only something beyond science can give us purpose. This is why science cannot answer why human life has value, why cruelty is wrong, why beauty moves us, why we long for justice, why we hunger for transcendence, why a purely material universe cannot satisfy the human heart. These questions stretch beyond prediction and measurement. They touch the core of human identity. And so we arrive at a profound realization. The limits of science are not the limits of reality. Science is extraordinary. But reality is bigger than science. Much bigger. And inside that space, the space beyond mechanism, beyond measurement, beyond mathematical description, the question of God is not only relevant, it becomes unavoidable. The God explanation, not a gap, but a foundation. Whenever someone brings God into a conversation about science, a familiar criticism appears. That's just the God of the gaps. You're plugging God into things science hasn't explained yet. But this objection completely misunderstands the argument. The God explanation is not a patch for ignorance. It is not a placeholder for scientific mysteries. It is not a stopgap that shrinks as science grows. The God explanation is something far more profound. God is not an extra piece inside the universe. God is the foundation that makes the universe, and science, possible. Let's make this absolutely clear. When a physicist explains how stars form, no Christian says, "Ah, but God did it instead." No. God is not an alternative to natural causes. God is the explanation for why natural causes exist at all. Science explains the mechanisms. God explains the metaphysics, the ground of being, the origin of law, the source of intelligibility. These are not competing explanations. They are layered explanations. The same way a composer explains a symphony, a programmer explains a software system, an author explains a novel, an architect explains a building. None of these explanations conflict with the physical processes inside their creations. To say, science explains how the universe works, therefore God isn't needed, is like saying, the piano explains the music, so the pianist isn't real. Or, the chemical structure of ink explains the novel, so the author doesn't exist. Or, the blueprint explains the building, so we don't need the architect. Mechanism does not erase mind. Process does not erase purpose. Structure does not erase source. In fact, the more deeply we understand the universe through science, the more the question intensifies. Why is the universe structured so perfectly that science can discover its laws? This is not a question about gaps. It is a question about foundations. Consider this. Scientists assume the laws of nature are stable, predictable, and mathematically elegant. Why? Because the universe behaves that way. But why does it behave that way? Why does nature follow intelligible laws rather than randomness? Why is the universe rationally structured, a requirement for science to exist at all? Einstein confessed this openly. The most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. Comprehensibility is not a scientific finding. It is a philosophical miracle. It is the signature of a mind behind the cosmos. God is not a gap filler. God is the explanation for why the universe exists, why it has laws, why those laws are intelligible, why reason works, why mathematics maps perfectly onto physical reality, why consciousness can understand creation, why there is a cosmos rather than chaos. Science reveals the structure of the universe. God explains why the universe has structure at all. Science uncovers the story. God is the reason there is a story. And so, the question shifts, dramatically. If the universe is a book of laws, harmony, and mathematical beauty, who is the author? Fine-tuning. When science accidentally points beyond itself. If there is one discovery in modern science that shook even the most secular minds, it is this. The universe is astonishingly, unimaginably, mathematically fine-tuned for life. This is not poetry. Not wishful thinking. Not religious bias. It is physics. Take the cosmological constant, the force that controls the expansion of the universe. If it were different by 1 part in 10 to the power of 40, the universe would have collapsed back into a black hole, or expanded so fast that stars and galaxies could never form. Or look at the strength of gravity. If it were altered by a fraction in the 60th decimal place, matter would not clump together, no stars, no planets, no chemistry, no life. Or consider the strong nuclear force. Change it by 0.5%, and the universe becomes sterile. These numbers are not small adjustments. They are precision beyond anything the human mind typically grasps. To put it visually, a scientist once said that expecting life by random physical constants is like throwing a dart across the entire observable universe and hitting a target the size of an atom on the first try. This is fine-tuning. The more we learn, the clearer it becomes. The universe is not just suitable for life. It is exquisitely calibrated for life. And this forces the ultimate question. Why would a cold, blind, indifferent universe care about life at all? Why would its mathematical structure align perfectly to permit beings who can understand that structure? Science can measure the constants. But it cannot explain why they are the exact values required for consciousness to exist. So 3 explanations are usually offered. 1. Chance. This is the belief that the universe simply got lucky. But the probabilities are so microscopic that calling it luck is not an explanation, it is a shrug. A surrender disguised as confidence. Chance is not a cause. It is what we say when we have no cause. 2. The multiverse. This theory imagines billions of universes, each with different physical laws. In such a scenario, it is inevitable that one universe, ours, has the right conditions. But there are problems. There is zero empirical evidence for other universes. A multiverse requires a mechanism to generate these universes, which itself must be fine-tuned. Explaining one universe with infinite universes is not elegant. It is philosophical escapism. It multiplies mysteries rather than solving them. 3. Intelligence, God. The third option is the simplest. The universe looks designed because it is designed. Not by a physical object inside the universe, but by a mind beyond space, time, and matter. A mind capable of establishing the mathematical fabric of reality. A universe cannot fine-tune itself before it exists. A law cannot write itself. A mathematical structure cannot choose its own values. The fine-tuning of the universe is not just improbable. It is intentional. As physicist Freeman Dyson famously wrote, "The universe knew we were coming." This is not a scientific deduction. It is a philosophical interpretation of scientific data, the same way atheists interpret the same data differently. But here is the crucial question. Which interpretation best fits the evidence? Chance? Unparsimonious and irrational. Multiverse? Speculative and untestable. Design? Simple. Elegant. Coherent with the existence of consciousness, purpose, morality, reason, and intelligibility. Fine-tuning does not prove God in a laboratory sense. But it points powerfully toward a mind. A mind that precedes the universe. A mind that chooses the constants. A mind that writes the laws. A mind that stands behind the very possibility of science itself. Consciousness. The human mind is not a machine. If the fine-tuning of the universe points outward, toward the structure of the cosmos, then consciousness points inward, into the deepest mystery of human existence. And it is here that science meets a wall it cannot climb. Science can measure brainwaves. It can track neural pathways. It can identify the regions involved in memory, vision, emotion, and decision-making. But here is the problem. No matter how much we learn about the brain, we still cannot explain consciousness. Because consciousness is not a physical process. It is an experience. It is the difference between light hitting the retina and seeing a sunset. Between neural activity firing and feeling sorrow. Between electrical signals in your cortex and understanding a mathematical equation. Between molecules in your brain and knowing that you exist. Science can describe the mechanics. But the subjective experience, the I, the inner world, the mind, is beyond physical measurement. Let's ask a dangerous question. If every thought is nothing more than a chemical reaction, why trust any thought as true? Why trust your belief in science? Why trust logic? Why trust mathematics? Why trust reason itself? Chemical reactions do not produce truth. They merely produce effects. If your mind is purely physical, then truth, logic, morality, and meaning are illusions, convenient evolutionary tricks, not realities. But every human instinct rebels against this. We know, intuitively and rationally, that consciousness is real. That truth is real. That moral responsibility is real. That meaning is real. That love is real. These are not neuronal illusions. They are the deepest features of human life. This is why many of the world's leading philosophers, even non-religious ones, admit that consciousness cannot be reduced to matter. Because consciousness has properties nothing physical has. Subjectivity, what it feels like to be you. Intentionality, the mind can think about things. Rationality, the capacity for abstract thought. Unity, oneself across time, despite billions of changing atoms. Free will, the ability to choose. not merely react. None of these fit neatly into materialism. And so we return to an ancient truth. The human mind is not a machine. It is a mystery that points to something beyond matter. Consciousness is not an accident of neurons. It is the signature of a spiritual dimension. A clue that the universe is grounded in mind, not matter. A hint that intelligence is not the product of the universe. Intelligence is the source of the universe. In a material universe, consciousness should not exist. And yet it does. Which means the universe is more than material. And that points, powerfully, unmistakably, toward a creator who is not matter, but mind. Morality. Science gives power, but not purpose. Science is extraordinary at giving us power. It gives us technology, medicine, engineering, communication, and the ability to reshape the world. But there is one thing science can never give us: purpose. Science can tell you what is. It cannot tell you what ought to be. This is the divide that no amount of data, measurement, or experimentation can ever cross. Think of what science is fundamentally built on: observation, description, prediction, control. But morality is built on something completely different: meaning, responsibility, dignity, justice, value. These concepts are not scientific. They are not features of atoms. They are not properties of molecules. They are not mathematical equations. And yet they are the most important realities of human life. We do not live for quarks and electrons. We live for love, justice, courage, compassion, integrity, truth. But science alone cannot justify any of these. Let's test this with a few uncomfortable questions. Can science prove that human life has value? No, biology can describe your body, not your worth. Can science prove that cruelty is wrong? No, physics can measure force, not moral evil. Can evolution explain why you ought to be good? No, at best it explains why cooperative behavior helps survival, not why murder is objectively wrong. The moment you say, human beings have inherent dignity, you have left the world of science and entered the world of moral philosophy. Because science can tell you how to build a bomb, it cannot tell you why you shouldn't drop it. This leads to a profound truth that many people sense but rarely articulate. If morality is real, truly real, then morality requires a foundation beyond matter. You cannot derive moral truth from molecules. You cannot derive human rights from chemistry. You cannot derive justice from atoms. If the universe is purely physical, then morality is nothing more than preference, cultural habit, or evolutionary instinct. But no one truly believes that. No one believes that torturing a child is merely socially discouraged. No one believes that justice is just a human invention. No one believes that dignity is just a convenient illusion. We live as if moral truth is real, because it is. And if moral truth is real, then it must come from a real source. Not from nature. Not from evolution. Not from society. But from something, or someone, beyond the physical world. A transcendent source. A moral lawgiver. A foundation stable enough to justify words like right, wrong, good, evil, justice, compassion. Science can show us the tools of life. Only God can show us the meaning of life. Science can give us power. Only God can teach us how to use it. Science can describe the world. Only God can tell us why the world matters. Why we still need God. After exploring the edges of science, its brilliance, its power, its limits, the final question becomes unavoidable. If science can explain so much, why do we still need God? The answer is not emotional. It is not cultural. It is not psychological. It is philosophical, rational, intellectual, and ultimately existential. We need God because explanation is not the same as foundation. Science explains mechanisms. God explains existence. Science describes laws. God grounds why there are laws. Science maps the universe. God accounts for why the universe is intelligible. Science uncovers processes. God reveals purpose. Let's step back and gather the threads. Science cannot explain why there is a universe rather than nothing. Science cannot explain why the universe follows elegant mathematical laws. Science cannot explain why those laws allow life. Science cannot explain consciousness, the inner world, the mind, the self. Science cannot explain objective morality. Science cannot explain meaning. Science cannot explain reason itself, the very tool science relies on. So the question is not, does science explain everything? But rather, why does anything exist that can be explained by science? Imagine someone examining a cathedral. They can analyze the stones, measure the arches, map the acoustics, calculate the stresses in the walls. But none of that answers the question. Who built it? And why? The more science reveals about the universe, the more astonishing the underlying question becomes. Why is reality so perfectly structured for discoverability? We inhabit a universe where mathematics describes nature, logic maps reality, consciousness emerges, morality binds us, beauty moves us, and meaning calls to us. None of this fits into a materialistic worldview where matter is all that exists. Matter cannot explain mathematics. Matter cannot explain consciousness. Matter cannot explain morality. Matter cannot explain meaning. Matter cannot explain why matter itself exists. And here is where the argument becomes not only philosophical but personal. If consciousness is real, if morality is real, if truth matters, if love matters, if meaning matters, then God is not optional. God is necessary. Not the God of superstition. Not the God used to explain thunderstorms or disease. But the God who is the ground of being, the source of reason, the foundation of morality, the author of existence, the mind behind the fine-tuned universe, the origin of consciousness, the lawgiver behind moral truth, the meaning that gives purpose to the human story. Science is one of the greatest gifts humanity has ever received. But science is not God. Science cannot be God. Science was never meant to be God. Because science describes the masterpiece. Only God can explain the artist.